And the attendees are rolling in. We're going to get started in just a moment. We've got a big crowd tonight, so we're going to give folks just a second to join us. Okay, John, are you ready? We're going to get started.
I hope I am.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name's Angie Armour. I'm class of 1999, and I'm the Director of Alumni and Family Engagement here at St. Michael's. Unfortunately, we can't see your faces, but my guess is that you're smiling because in just a moment, I'm going to be turning this webinar over to the one and only John Carvellas. John is an emeritus professor of economics, and he's taught at St. Mike's for decades. He taught thousands of students, and when he saw the names of alumni who would be attending tonight, he said it was a really fun walk down memory lane. I am very appreciative of John taking the time out of his well-deserved retirement to be part of the Emeriti Faculty Speaker Series. Tonight's our third installment after hearing from Bill Wilson and Father Richard Barabee back in March. We're hoping to partner with more Emeriti faculty in the coming months, so stay tuned for that. All of our webinar recordings can be found on the St. Michael's College YouTube channel. So if you're looking for more, go check that out. Lastly, before I turn things over to John, I'd like to plug our faculty speaker series, which will start January 4th. We have several current faculty members who will be present at that to talk about their research. And we will be sending out an email sometime around December 20th with more information, so stay tuned for that. Okay, John, I'll be here to help with the chat, but I'm going to go off camera and I'm going to turn things over to you.
All righty. Thank you, Angie. I don't know if I should thank you for having me here, but thank you for your help. I'm doing this with a certain amount of trepidation, largely because haven't talked in front of anybody in 7 years. But the real trepidation is this idea of talking to a computer screen and not having a live audience is really freaking me out. I usually measure my my success by how quickly people go to sleep and how long they stay awake. And maybe we should have a chat for these. But in this situation, I can't look at somebody and yell at them and say, or throw an eraser at them or hit them with my stick. So it's kind of weird, and I'm not sure how well I'm going to do with it. By the way, Bob Ryan, time to wake up, all right? So I know I can't see him, but I know that he deserves me saying that to him. So, all right, Bobby. All righty. When I read the list, as Angie said, it was a walk down memory lane, and it just reminded me, I taught here for 40 years, and probably 20 good years, and I just realized how lucky I was. It couldn't have been a better place to have a job, and I couldn't have more students that I enjoyed. Just so lucky, and I'm not going to cry. And I thank you all. I wish I could thank each one of you individually. About 85, based on the list, about 80 or 90% of you were names that popped out as former students or former student athletes also. And it just, your names brought a huge smile to my face. All right, stop that. Let's go to the economics, which will dry us all out. If we cry, it'll be over other things. So we start with a picture of me in my, where I'd rather be right now, with 74 there in St. Augustine, Florida Beach, St. Augustine Beach today. And that's the roof of my little house that I live in. If you look way off in the distance, we are allowed when we rent it to call it Ocean View, because you see a speck of blue somewhere in the distance. All right, we're here to talk about the federal deficit, a controversial topic, and you can tell I'm out of practice. And what I'm going to try to cover is, in general terms, what I might call the bad, the ugly, and perhaps the not too bad of the federal deficit. It's always in the news. It's been in the news since I had a full head of hair, since before I had a full head of hair, before I could grow a beard. and we'll talk about that. We'll show a bunch of data. I'll try to go quickly. I'll try not to put you into a coma. I should have my watch right out in front of me here. Then we're going to talk about a theory that's gotten some notoriety recently, but usually from the progressive wing, called I'm calling it the age of magic money. It's something called, you may have seen it in the paper, modern monetary theory, or MMT. I will kind of trash that a little bit, but then I'm going to have a conclusion where I try to eventually annoy everyone, no matter what your political beliefs are. All right, so there we go. I have no idea if anybody's listening. Angie, I'm going crazy here. All right. But the final conclusion of all this is that really, after all is said and done, whoever is in office soft pedals the deficit, and whoever is out of office screams and yells that the world's coming to an end. Ultimately, neither side really care, but maybe they shouldn't. Maybe they shouldn't. All right, let's move to a little bit of, oh, that's the old guy. Let's go to a little bit of data. Let's look at Donald Trump's last fiscal year. The next fiscal year just ended October 1st, and I didn't get data. I can tell you what it is roughly, but I'm going to give you some numbers since these are the only numbers you've seen up to now. Maybe they won't shock you, but when we look at some other numbers, we'll talk about what they look like in comparison to the last history of the country. Basically, we had about a $3.2 trillion deficit in the 2020 fiscal year. That started in October 1st, 2019, and ended October 1st, 2020, before the election. This fiscal year, it's a little bit smaller, but it's still way beyond anything we've ever seen. It appears like it came in, final accounting's not there, but between 2.7 and 2.8 trillion dollars. Trillion, that number boggles the imagination. So that's the current deficit. That's number, a deficit is for a given year. We'll look at one slide of the total debt, and that's adding all the deficits up or subtracting the surpluses, which we've had occasionally in your lifetime, but not very often. And that gives you the debt. This is about the annual deficit. Here's the budget year. I don't think we even need to spend much time on this. What you do learn is that, and this, it's the revenue. Oh, I keep pointing to the graph. The revenues are a lot. Oh, I do have a mouse here. Revenues are about quite a bit lower than the outlays. And in a lot of the outlays, all of this is basically what would be called mandatory spending. A lot of it is for me. Thank you. Social Security, that's there. Medicare, that's there. Look at that. We make up about a quarter of the budget. And given the aging of the population, that's gonna be a bigger and bigger percentage, unless we do something. And there are things that can be done, but there's no political will. And actually, I think there's a lot less political will now than there was 10 years ago, because the country is so deeply divided and none of us are talking to each other, especially in our own families on occasion. But that's another story. Notice the net interest is 1.6% of GDP. Keep that in mind. That's of the budget. That's how much is paid for previous deficit, previous debt. Because we'll look at that in a minute, and we'll see therein lies a huge potential problem. There's some more of this data. We don't need to look at a lot of it. I'll look at one thing here. I can't read the bottom of the screen. The deficit this year is of 2020 was about 14.9% of GDP. Probably this coming year will be closer to 13%. It's falling some, and the GDP is rising. Over a long number of years, I can't see the bottom of that screen on my computer here, it averaged about 3.3%. So the current deficits we're running are about 4 times, as a percentage of GDP, compared to the size of the economy, are 4 times as big. All right. Let's talk a little bit about national debt. Let's get back to the right screen, and a little bit of quasi-theory real quick. So I've got three views of the debt. One I'll call my dad's view, the view I grew up with, and generally any politician who's out of office and is talking about the federal deficit, this is the view they seem to present. And that basically is, we're gonna go bankrupt. If you don't pay your house loan and you owe a lot of money in your house, you owe a lot of money in your car, you don't pay it, someone comes to the house and says, hey buddy, you don't own this house anymore. If you don't pay your bills, you go bankrupt. Well, that is the view I grew up and certainly was preached to me by my father when he was talking to me. I gave him a lot of reasons not wanting to talk to me. And in fact, anytime you hear a politician, and they'll always be the ones out of office talking about it, it sounds like the world is now coming to an end and blame the other party because we have nothing to do with it. In fact, that's a bunch of baloney. I don't want to go online using real words. All right. So that's the old view of the debt. That's the view I had. And in 1963, Professor Bob Pullen, who suffered me greatly over 3 years, sophomore through senior year, didn't see me too often in class, but suffered me greatly. And I must have been a class I went to my sophomore year, because I remember it actually very clearly, started to explain why the deficit, federal deficit, is different than private deficit. And I was shocked. I thought this guy is a flaming radical. He was a 50-year-old, very conservative gentleman. And he treated me a hell of a lot better than I ever deserved, believe me. And given his attitude, is probably more reason why I ended up wanting to teach at a college as opposed to a university. And basically he taught the same stuff I was peddling for 40 years. Federal deficit, you don't go bankrupt in the traditional sense because most of it, not all of it, and less, most of it's owed to ourselves. So you have a redistribution when it's paid off. Some people are taxed to pay for it, but it's a redistribution to other citizens. Or who owns a lot of the federal deficit? The Federal Reserve. And indeed, they just can buy it at will. They just buy $100 billion or $1 billion worth of bonds. And then they say, hey, by the way, you got $1 billion in your bank account. So we just created that money. So they can, and they have a lot of federal deficit. So it's basically internal. You don't go bankrupt traditionally. We'll see some more data in a minute that historically, it's actually been not a big problem. It's diminished over the years until really horribly in the last 10 years or so. Okay. And in fact, cutting the deficit, which might reduce government purchases, would actually might hurt the economy. So, and there's a list in your principles textbook. I haven't looked at one in 7 years, thank God. But in fact, even when I retired, it still looked like 1963 when it talked about the deficit. Why? It can be a problem, but not the problem that you think of it as we're going to go bankrupt. There is a third theory I mentioned already. I'll mention now, but I won't describe. We'll wait to the end. Modern monetary theory, MMT. Now, it's not completely new. In fact, it was around for a long time, but it became much more popular. Stephanie Kelton at SUNY Stony Brook. If you want to look into the theories and her theories, she's an economic advisor, by the way, of Senator Sanders, but he has not espoused this. He's not he can be more cautious than his public pronouncements sometimes make it seem. And in fact, she's all over YouTube with 45, 50-minute lectures that won't be any more exciting than my lecture. So Bobby, you're still awake? All right. So this theory presents a lot of controversy, and we will look at it after we look at some data. And then I'll make the one statement that I think has nothing to do with economics textbooks, but I pretty firmly believe. Here's the national debt over a large number of years, going back to This is World War II. This gives you an idea. This is the sum of all the annual deficits. And why did Professor Bullet Bob Pullen not really worry about it? Well, here's 1945 or so. Here's where I was staggering. I can't see the years on the horizontal axis, but around here is when I was staggering in and out of classrooms at Colby. And you can see it was, of course, declining. And it stayed fairly low percentage of our total debt as a percentage of annual GDP. It went up, we'll see when it went up, and then it dropped some again. And then it went right back right now to about where it was at the end of World War II. So it's in the last, well, we'll see the years. We'll get to the specific years. So it's exploded, and projections are projections. Remember, you don't want to learn to trust economists too much, but the projection is at the rate we're going, it's going to be way up here as a percentage of GDP, as high as maybe 150%. Oddly enough, this 98%, as you see by that cursor, that should have been, that was called the disaster point. But there are countries, Japan, in fact, their debt has been at 100 or over 100% of their GDP for 20 years. And their issue isn't that they're going bankrupt because of that. Their issue is their economy is actually too soft, too slow. They have not been able, with this stimulus, really goose the economy up as much as they should. Here is a more important graph. And I can also get pretty political in this graph. And I guess I will. The hell. If you go back to it's about 1980. See where the cursor is. GDP, pardon me, the debt was usually $100 billion a year. Sometimes as much as 200 billion, but rarely. It was more in the 50 billion range. We worried about it. We talked about it just like we do now. Give you an idea by way of $1 billion. And this is from ancient teaching principles of economics, because the money starts to mean nothing. Everett Dirksen, who was you'd have to be Walter Bauman's age, who might be here, Walter, hello, Walter, to remember the name Everett Dirksen. He was a senator. Walter's even older than I am, but he's a hell of a lot better shape than I am. Senator in the 50s, I think in Indiana or Illinois, had this deep, deep voice and talking about the budgets. And I remember as a fairly young kid, probably 6th, 7th, 8th grade, him saying $1 billion here, $1 billion there, eventually it becomes real money. Well, how big is $1 billion? If I tried to get Angie to take $1 million from me when I came in tonight. She was suspicious. I don't know why. And don't laugh at me, Angie. And you weren't the first woman to laugh at me. Hopefully it won't be the last either. And if she took it, the deal would be she has to spend $1,000 a day. Well, if she did that, in about 3 years, she'd come back and she'd say, I'm broke. I don't have any money. Well, if I gave her $1 trillion, not $1 million, trillion. How much bigger is it? Oh, excuse me. Oh, I jumped ahead. I'm sorry. I gave her $1 billion. I better focus. $1 billion. How much bigger is $1 billion? If she spent $1,000 a day, she wouldn't come back in 3 years, 30 years, 300 years. She'd come back in 3,000 years. She would have spent all the money. How much more? $1 billion. It's 1,000 billion. Now we're at $1 trillion. How big is $1 trillion? 3,000, 30,000, 300. She'd come back in 3 million years. So to paraphrase Everett Dirksen, $1 trillion here and there, soon it gets to be real money. Well, if you go back to when some of you were in college, $50, $100 million, $1 billion a year was a lot. This axis is billion, that's 400, that's 800, that's 1.2. There was a tax cut, and here's where I will get political. We've had 3 major tax cuts that were all promised to solve this deficit. In this case, it basically went up to around $200 or $300 billion a year. Then it got somewhat better. George Bush, the elder, actually attempted to solve the deficit. It may have raised taxes some, and in fact, it may help make him be a one-term president, as you might remember. When even if you disagree with your president, back in the day, everyone was dealt with a certain element of dignity. So the deficit continued. Bill Clinton came into office, and oddly enough, in fact, he may have been the most successful conservative president in my lifetime. And some of the things are coming back to bite him on the butt with a lot of things that bit him, but economically speaking, he actually where'd my cursor go, damn it. He actually solved the deficit. And you see, here's the break-even line. He had, in fact, 3 years of a balanced or actually a surplus. So in your lifetime, most of you in your lifetime, there were a couple years of a surplus. Then George W. Bush took over. It was, again, another tax cut, which was promised to solve any deficit we might have. And indeed, the deficit went up to about $500 billion, $600 billion. Started to get better. We hit the crisis of 2008, 6, 7, and 8, where my retirement money, I signed a retirement deal in 2006. And by 2009, my retirement assets were 30% lower than when I signed it. That's an economist's predictions. And we survived. The economy dropped and the tax rates were lower. And between the two, we went to the first time over $1 trillion deficit in a year. Started to climb out of it, and then Barack Obama got elected. And in fact, maybe he shouldn't have, but in fact, during his 8 years, the deficit shrunk from about a 1.2 trillion to about 600 billion. Still huge, like huge by old standards, oh damn it, but shrunk quite a bit. Some would argue, in fact, it shouldn't have shrunk that much. That helped add to the slow economic recovery. For those of you who are retired, most of you aren't from the list, but there are a few people I didn't have, who say Mike's grads from the 60s. That kind of slow recovery was kind of perfect for us because we weren't looking for a job. So usually the slower it goes up, the longer it lasts. And talking about the economy, and in fact, it's lasted mostly since then. So it's been good. Then we hit, once again, there we go. He left office. We had several things went on. A tax cut started to go up again and got to about a trillion. And then we hit 800 billion. And then we hit the pandemic, and bingo, we're way down here at $3 trillion. So most of the time we were concerned about it. In retrospect, it was billion here, billion there. Now it's a trillion here, trillion there. What does that mean? Here is another data point. I'll start going quicker. I got to get out of this. This is the percentage of net interest that is paid on the debt each year compared to the economy. And that's the important thing. Our first house, the mortgage was $27,000. Actually, our only house till we bought the vacation home in St. Augustine. Our mortgage was $27,000. Doesn't sound like you certainly couldn't buy you barely buy a Mazda SUV now with that. That's about what I probably paid for the last one. Sounds like nothing. But when you're making $10,000 a year, which I was in 1974, 75, it was a big mortgage for me. So the amount you owe, the amount you pay, of course, depends upon what you're paying on. So notice, actually, right up through 2012 or so, the annual payment on the deficit was at or below 2% of GDP, right up to around, right here, below 2%, below the long-term average. The projections, once again, are at the rate we're going in the last 3 years, this year included, by the way, we may be paying 8 to 11% on the debt alone in interest payments. And that in turn would be quite a detriment. The projection, remember that. Here's another example, just real quick. The purple is the deficit. Here we are right here, right now. Notice the deficit is much bigger. The blue is the interest payment. And it's relatively negligible, but the projection is, here's 2025, 2050. Well, that's when your children or grandchildren will be paying the taxes. And now, in that point, it makes up probably 60% of the government budget. So something appears to me, something's got to be done. I don't think we have the political will to do it, but that's another matter. All right, so we looked at some data. I hope at a point in time, if we're in class, I'd have you all stand up and stretch, because I have probably put you into a semi-comatose state. You're feeling very relaxed, your alpha waves. And I've got 4 pages of notes, of which I haven't looked at, of course, and I guess I won't bother. So now I'm going to reverse and quickly look at, in a real simple view, at MMT, Modern Monetary Theory. And again, if you're interested, just go on YouTube, type in Stephanie Kelton, and you'll have a plethora, I'm not sure which, of YouTube videos, some as long as an hour, lecturing on it. She's a strong advocate, and she has a small cadre of economists. Simple view, and I'm leaving a lot out because a lot I don't know. I got better things to do with my time than spend hours and hours studying this. I got naps to take. If the government, the basic premise is, if the government can borrow in its own currency, in other words, if it's viable, a lot of governments can't really, not any number. If the US can borrow in dollars, then there is no fiscal budget constraint, because all they got to do is borrow the money. And how do they pay for it? They pay through the creation of money, not taxes. Milton Friedman, the old monetarist, long dead, must spin in his grave like an airplane propeller when he sees this espoused, because he argues that money, expansion of money, becomes inflationary. So that's a real simple view of modern monetary theory. Forget the budget deficit. So it doesn't mean a damn thing. Just, you want to buy a couple new aircraft carriers, just borrow the money. The Fed loans you the money. The Fed creates money, and you can buy the aircraft carriers. There's a lot of criticisms of this. The biggest criticism, of course, is the idea that inflation leading to hyperinflation. Now, once again, I came here in 74, and in the late 60s, and then through the 70s, until Paul Volcker, early 80, slammed the door on it. We had creeping inflation, and we had walking inflation, and then we had galloping inflation that reached a point of close to 12% a year. 12% a year, prices double about every 7 years, 7.5 years. And we were close to that. And remember, when I came here, while I was in grad school in 72, bought a Plymouth Duster, $2,500. Now you couldn't buy the same Plymouth Duster, probably costs a lot more than that, if any still exists. So the biggest criticism, and I've heard Stephanie Kelton in 1 or 2 of her videos say, inflation's not a problem. I don't know where that comes from, because it is a problem. It can be a problem. In fact, what are we seeing now? We're seeing inflation 6.5%, saying it's going to be temporary. I don't know about that. I don't know about a lot of things, but I'm a little worried it's going to start to get embedded. And when it gets embedded, once expectations change, once people start to expect more money, more prices, higher prices, behavior changes. Back in the late 70s, I can remember the perfect example of inflation expectation when a philosophy professor, to be unnamed, came flying out of his office door and said, "We just got a 7% raise." and inflation went up 11%. I lost 4%. And I thought, man, if this guy understands this, everybody does. Everybody has inflation expectations. They expect different behavior. So that's the first problem. My uneducated concerns, of which I have a lot of, but related to this. First of all, the first premise, first chapter, the first lecture of your principles as you embark on the wonderful course is there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. Everything's got a cost. And that's the concept of opportunity cost. And this seems to wave away. There's a free lunch problem. There's no free lunch problem. That we're going to have a free lunch. And I'm doing a cartoon view of MMT, but you do all have to do something else later tonight. So just explaining why it says you don't really need to worry about budget deficits. And it also turns a little more theoretical macro policy on its head, because fiscal policy, government spending and taxes, what this is saying is if the government spends more, the taxes are less than the government spending, which it usually is, as we've seen, and it gets bigger, the gap, you just use monetary policy to solve it. In other words, there's no independent monetary policy. Monetary policy is a slave to fiscal policy. And the last thing any of us want, as far as I'm concerned, and I'll fight this to the grave, is you don't want politicians running the Federal Reserve. The independence of the Federal Reserve to make the hard decisions when they have to be made has probably been a savior. They irk people at times because of it, but that's because they don't have to run for office. And if you look at little studies of countries that have a politicized central bank and those that have an independent central bank, you usually see very different inflationary and also exchange rate differences. And those who are politicized have problems with declining value of their currency, have a problem with inflation, a lot more than other, and we're talking about hyperinflation. We're talking sometimes thousands of percent a year. So I don't want politicians running the Fed. And here, this is really odd because fiscal policy is now running monetary policy. And asked about inflation, one of the advocates said, that's okay, you raise taxes and that stops inflation. The practicality of raising and lowering taxes just because of inflation, it ain't gonna happen in my lifetime. You hardly do it if it's necessary and it's clear that you need to do it. So this is a theory. This is what's taken over. Let's just a couple more slides. If I can get rid of that. Angie, if I put them to sleep, any questions? Angie, any questions? All right, they're all in a coma. Okay. Bobby. What's up? All right. Hey, we're almost finished. You can go back to your TV show. Hey, good. All right. I must have left a hell of a lot. I got 3 pages of notes here. Got my worries. I can go to. It's a lot better when it's voluntary, isn't it? It's all right. Let me finish with okay, I'll do this slide and then I'll babble and people can come and go if they want. And here I will actually probably get some people PO'd at me, but I'm going to do it a little bit. I tried to actually not be too political when I taught because my job isn't to tell you what to think. Especially, it'd be a hypocrite if I did. But is to try to, in my feeble way, try to help you to think clearly. However, in this instance, and now this is the arguments I'd make with my brother-in-law, who's captive of a certain news organization I refuse to mention. Since 1980, that's when we started with our data, 4 administrations appear to act as though deficits don't matter. In fact, to raise deficits. Right now, I would say I'd including Joe Biden as a 4th, because I don't think they're gonna worry about it. And in fact, the budgets are still, given the 2 infrastructure bills, obviously, whether you're for or against them, they're not worrying, they're not worrying about the deficit. The other 3 administrations that raised the deficits all did it at least partly by cutting taxes. Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump. And if you look at the data, that's when when the deficits all went up. In fact, they all followed. Now, the argument was, so you're Republican, you argue, I cut taxes and I make the deficit smaller. That's the supply side argument. And oddly enough, that argument was used first and foremost by President Reagan, and Larry Kudlow was one of his, I believe, one of his advisors, a man I have a great distaste for. And remember him, and of course, some of you might remember how really Arthur Laffer I have even more distaste for. Basically argued, we got $100 billion deficit, we cut taxes, we will do away with it. And in fact, they doubled it. When President Bush, George W. Bush was in office, the same argument was made, and combined the tax cuts with the crash, which cuts tax collections. And we went from $200 billion deficit to $1.2 trillion deficit. And then Obama, while he was in office, the deficit for whatever reason fell through increase in taxes, modest, and to about 500 or 600 billion. And with Donald Trump in office, he's left his office his last full fiscal year with a $3.2 trillion deficit, about triple 2.5 times what George Bush's was. The 2 presidents that reduced the deficits, of course, were Obama, and they may have done it. They did it with Republican Congresses and Senate, and Clinton. Clinton actually worked very closely with Republican, I believe. Since the Federal Reserve, of course, is not part of the MMT, which is fiscal policy, but in fact, between the fiscal policy, which has been very expansionary, and since 2007-8, the Federal Reserve has just expanded the money supply, an incredibly or potential money supply. You look at their balance sheets, and now we're talking about right now we're talking about, are they going to taper? Taper is not reducing the supply of money. They're buying private bonds monthly and just slow down that purchase. They're still buying them. I'm not saying they're doing the wrong thing. They're probably doing it. Certainly helped me. They've sustained the stock market that makes my retirement a lot more comfortable. I wouldn't be in that little teeny house in Florida without them. But in fact, they behave like it, and the government has behaved like something they would never want to admit to. Basically, they've all behaved like modern monetary theory is true. They'd never admit it, but they show no sign that they really believe there's a constraint. Forget the rhetoric. The person out of office always acts like there's a constraint. We got to worry about it. Once they're in office, at best they're silent, or worse, they lie about it and say, we're going to do this, this, and this, and cut deficit, and it increases. So where do we end up? I have no idea. I know if it really is nearly as bad as some of the projections, certainly I won't be around, and a few of the people listening here won't be around, but a lot of you will, and your grandchildren, your children will. And I had a relative say, oh, the kids have it so easy today. Oh, thanks. And the old people, oh, when we were kids, it was so tough. And one of the few times I really got peeved, and I said that because to me it's completely the opposite. Especially when I was a kid, You just had this boneheaded assumption things always get better, even with the Vietnam War and stuff like that. You're going to be better off than your parents. And indeed, kids nowadays are under enormous social pressures, economic pressures, and pressure of not doing as well as they're used to in a sense, and environmental pressures. So things are better. And indeed, I'm in favor of an active government, but I'm also in favor of dealing with a deficit in a mature level, and I'm not going to hold my breath waiting for it. I guess that's it. I'm babbling away. I want to tell you how much I love all of you guys. It was the greatest run of my life. I did a lot of boneheaded things when I was younger. I don't know how I was lucky enough to end at St. Mike's. And I wish I could give all of you a hug. So good night, and hope to see you at a reunion, not this year. It's my 56th reunion. We didn't have a 55 at Colby. So I got to go up there and say to everybody, oh, you haven't changed a bit. You're 50 pounds heavy, you don't have any hair, but you haven't changed a bit. Love you all. Have a great night, and keep St. Michael's in your heart. All right.